Good morning. My name is Toby Heaps, and I'm the CEO of Corporate Knights. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this 5th edition of our 5-part series on Earth Index for Canada. Today, we're going to be looking at the green agricultural wave, the opportunities for us to decarbonize one of the most important sectors in Canada that touches all regions of our vast country. Before we get underway, I'm going to make a land acknowledgement. So Corporate Knights honors the people and land of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. Corporate Knights acknowledges the land that we are on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. Corporate Knights also acknowledges that Toronto, where we are located, is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'd also like to acknowledge our partner who's helping to enable this series, IBM, which has been an excellent partnership over this 5-part series, helping to showcase some of the powers of technology to assist in the decarbonization of our major sectors. Normally, we have some representation from the federal government. Unfortunately, some of you may have heard there is a avian influenza going through the Maritimes with turkeys, and it's a bit of a crisis management situation right now at the ministry. So we will be communicating the results of this to Minister Bibeau and her parliamentary secretary, Francis Drouin. So before we get underway, I'm going to just give some brief words of context for our research director, Ralph Torrey. As many of you will know who have joined us for other editions of this series, Ralph is the number cruncher and the person who does the math of climate change. And he has been doing this for some time. As many of you will know, back in the late 80s, when there was the first international summit on climate change, which was held in Toronto, the nations of the world, Ralph was tasked to come up with the first global greenhouse gas reduction target. So this is something he's been doing for some time. And now it's nice to see the rest of the world putting this as a first priority. And we're looking forward to closing the say-do gap. There's huge ambition, and we need to get that ambition to implementation and close that say-do gap. So without further ado, I'll pass it to Ralph, and then the discussion will get underway. Ralph?
Thank you, Toby. And if anyone is having trouble on the panel in particular, since I can see you hearing me, let me know, because I am having some resource problems with the audio and video here this morning. I'm going to be brief. We have a chart here which gives a summary of the official view, if you like, of greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector in Canada as they are represented in our national inventory. This sector perhaps, well, first of all, those of you who have been attending some of these other sessions will recognize the shape of this chart, unfortunately, because over and over again, what we're seeing as we delve into the sector level performance of Canadian greenhouse gas emissions over the last 15 years is a tremendous inertia in the system, which has simply not yielded to whatever efforts have been made to try and bring emissions down. On the other hand, the emissions have not been growing very much. They have been somewhat stalled at the levels that they were at when about 15 years ago, with modest growth, generally speaking. That's true of the agricultural sector as well. Nevertheless, we have little to show in terms of emission reduction progress from this sector, which leaves a very large, what we call a say-do gap, the gap between what we need to be doing to have to be on track for the targets and the commitments that we've made at a national level, and what we have actually been able to achieve. Another thing about this sector is, and I know that a number of our panelists will be addressing this in different ways, but if the environmental crisis and the climate crisis in general represents a breakdown in some ways of the relationship we have with the land in a general sense, it's nowhere more evident and nowhere more difficult to avoid that reality than when considering the agricultural sector. The emissions from this sector relate to the fuel consumption that is used in modern agricultural, industrialized, and mechanized agricultural practices. It also relates to the nitrogen fertilizers that are used in this industry. It also reflects the energy intensity of what food has become in our industrialized society. One way or another, by far the largest portion of the emissions that are generated in our agricultural activities can be traced back to the meat-centered focus of our diet. I'm not putting forward a vegetarian agenda. I'm simply pointing out the fact that we've evolved into a very energy and emission intensive vector in the way that we develop our food, and that's reflected in the agricultural sector's emissions. We know these numbers are low. We may hear a little bit more from the National Farmers Union on that as we proceed here today. We're all anticipating work that they've been doing to try and improve our understanding of what these emissions really look like when you break them down. We know they're higher than this, and that's partly just because it's difficult to identify all of the different agricultural contributions to emissions in the official numbers. And there's also very energy intensive inputs to agriculture in the form of fertilizers and so on. And if you start adding the energy that it takes to produce those products into the total, the numbers go up again. So what you're looking at here at 73 megatons is perhaps 10% of Canada's official greenhouse gas inventory. If you were to add in some of these other factors, we probably would be looking at a number of 100 megatons or more. While the overall trend doesn't show much change, we know that there are countervailing forces at work underneath this line. Nitrogen emissions related to nitrogen fertilizer applications have been the biggest contributor to upward pressure on agricultural emissions in Canada. At the same time, a moderation in the size of the beef cattle herd has been holding emission growth from being higher than it would otherwise be. But all in all, what we see in 2022, when we look at the greenhouse gas intensity of our agricultural system, is a situation where we have not yet been successful at reducing its contribution to the climate problem, at least in terms of its emissions. There's also another side to the agricultural sector's involvement, if you want to put it that way, in the climate change problem, which is the direct relationship of the carbon in the soil to agricultural practices. I think a somewhat more positive story there, but I will leave it to the experts to address that as we go along here this morning. But we can't fall back on what's happening with the land use and the soil carbon as a reason for not addressing the essentially fossil fuel-based emissions from the agricultural industry itself. These are going to have to come down and come down dramatically if we are going to be successful in having this sector make its fair contribution to meeting the country's greenhouse gas reduction targets. So I think I'll leave it at that, Toby, just as a very high level overview of the emissions from this sector, the fact that they have not been going down. There's a lot of complexity here, more than in most other sectors. And that translates also into a lot of opportunities for addressing the problem, which I'm sure are going to come up in the next hour. Thank you.
Thanks, Ralph. That's a nice overview and context. And so it's useful to know, because sometimes in all the clutter of all the announcements, it can seem like we're doing everything we need to be doing. So it's useful to know that we're only moving at about 14% the rate that we need to move at in order to be consistent and in line with the country's national climate targets by 2030, which requires us to reduce agricultural emissions each year in the order of about 3 million tons. And right now it's a little bit less than half a ton for the most recent year that we have data. And thanks, you helpfully pointed out the main culprit of the growth, which is the nitrogen, which also has a lot of downsides for the farmers, which we'll hear about in terms of adding more expenses. It's one of the number one expenses for farmers, the purchase of nitrogen fertilizers, and it also contributes to the huge mounting debt of $121 billion that Canadian farmers are saddled with right now. And so this is an area that's actually quite exciting, because the opportunity for the people, for the farmers who are stewards of the land, to take better care of the land, if we can create a more sensible system in line with our goals, huge in terms of reducing their costs, in terms of increasing their economic resilience, and also in expanding markets, as we see major food companies, including Nature's Path, who we have here with us today, and even companies like PepsiCo, who have a new Pepsi challenge where they want to have 100% of all agricultural sourced products that are going into their food and drink to be 100% regenerative by 2025. So there's a huge trend sweeping here, and Canada is so well placed, both from our Indigenous roots, which we'll hear a little bit in a moment, our vast productive land. We're one of the, we have a huge country, all know that, and it's so fertile, and also our entrepreneurship, as we'll hear from Adam, who's heading up one of the most exciting plant-based enterprises in Canada, out of Peterborough, that's raised tens of millions of dollars and is making inroads in all sorts of game-changing places in our rich sort of network of farmers markets and organic farmers, and the collectives that have been created in terms of the Farmers for Climate Solutions and National Farmers Union. So we're going to get the discussion underway now. And first, it would be really interesting to hear from Terry Lynn Brandt, who's the founder of the Mohawk Seedkeeper Gardens. Terry Lynn, listening to this and observing the larger food system that we created, there's an alternative that goes back even millennia, certainly many centuries, in terms of the practices, the Indigenous practices, cultivating our land and nourishing our land and our people. And I wondered if you could share a little bit of that wisdom and any ideas for how we might make that more widespread in the Canadian context.
Thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's not often an opportunity that Indigenous people have to speak with big agriculture. In fact, we're generally pretty much ignored in the context of Canada and most of the international community in terms of listening, even though we have people like the United Nations and David Suzuki out there saying, work with your Indigenous people, try to figure out what they were doing to see how we can maybe better off some of the practices that we have today. So thank you very much for including me. It's nice to be here. One of our big things and lessons that, first of all, is sometimes it's just our frame of mind and our thoughts. We don't really, our words in our languages is Jinhekwan is for like food, right? And for us, the word literally means life sustainer. Okay, so it's the things that sustain your life. So when you think of something in that sense, it's a little bit different than thinking, oh, it's a bag of potatoes and it's on sale at the Zayres this month, right? So we have a whole society. Indigenous agriculture is like that. It is very much a family oriented. It is very much, it follows the cycles of nature, okay? We use sun and star, the moon planting times. So we try to work with to us, what are other natural forces that exist and support our agriculture, okay? So we look to those things as our helpers. Most of the time, those kinds of things are just kind of thought of as being out there in some kind of la-la land, and modern agriculture wouldn't even ever think of, what do you mean look at the stars to plant, okay? So those supporters and helpers are really important to us in our agriculture. We are very much into seasonal eating people. We eat what's in season. We preserve and dry, so we change those forms of our foods for the times of year when those are not available. So we're not eating those, we're not worrying about having certain kinds of fresh agriculture 100% of the time, all the time. And because of that way of eating, it makes our diet very much more healthy. As we go through the seasons of the year, our diet, we actually have transitional times. We are very soon going into the maple syrup time, which is for the Haudenosaunee people, the very first agricultural crop that we start to gather from. we drink a lot of that sap at that time because it's considered our medicines. It's what cleans our body, gets us ready for a spring diet that is coming. So we look to those things. The balance in our agriculture is really important to us. We try very much to use what is local or what we produce as the resource to either fix a problem or support or be a helper. Okay, we're not trying to bring something in from halfway across the country. And I think that's always been our problem, trying to import a little bit too much, even if it's sometimes around the world. So I think sometimes we have to think about that. We do eat our own seeds. Okay, I am a seed keeper in my community. My role is to make sure ancestral seeds, corns, beans, squash, just different kinds of seeds that we always have are still available and offerable. We feel that that's what makes us a healthier people. Okay. Our agriculture is what we call earth healing. If you are destroying earth, then you're not a farmer as far as our people are concerned. You're a killer. Okay. In our sense of the way that you have to be able to heal the earth, be able to make her better than when you found her. Okay. If you're destroying and killing, then you're not doing our cycle of agriculture or our cycle of nature anything that's any good. Okay. We always had the collective kitchen, community gardens, whatever you want to call them, something that people really have to, kind of get back involved with in terms of because society's lost such a sense of where its food comes from, how it's made, being there. And even if it's those very tiny fresh produce in the spring, we have to think about rebuilding, reconstructing our societies. Why do we have to have concrete and pavement everywhere, right? Where's the place to put the food, the little bits? Because it helps not just with the feeding of the people, but in our agricultural system, we are very tied to our mental state. Okay, so certain agricultural ceremonies reflect our mental state and help support that. So that's really important. Putting our hands in the soil is to reflect that. So a lot of the old, what we would call the Indigenous practices are really today, you're starting to see them in modern practices. Okay, but again, we're ignored. We're not given credit for being the ones that were the promoters of these things originally, that we did a lot of these kinds of techniques. So I think that again is working hand in hand with Indigenous people to figure out what were you doing and how did you tweak it or how was it done so that perhaps we can take it to a larger scale. Having drought resistant local seeds, that's the big thing. Oh, you have to have regional seed banks. Well, we always did. I think since time immemorial, I have seeds that I carry that from my family that have been here since before the European arrived. We've always kept our lines of seeds. So that whole concept of having a regional seed bank, which is important, right, is something we've always done. And the fact that we still save seeds and, is something I'd really like to see Big Ag start to figure out how the heck do we get back to saving seeds instead of reproducing, because in not saving, you're not allowing the seed to develop the spirit of the land and to develop and grow in the way that it will, that reflects the earth that it's under. And that's, to us, is really important. We're dry land farmer people generally versus the intensive farming of Western agriculture. So those are like two ends of the globe that we got to figure out somehow. How do we marry those kind of things? Our Indigenous people have always created garden buffers, okay? So we don't end up with things like the green plume out in the lakes caused by agricultural runoff. Nothing left our property, right? Those buffer sunchoke barriers that we have around our gardens, they had a purpose, not just to grow that food. They were also there to clean the waters or to do anything that could be escaping. What they call chop and drop and mulching and all these kinds of newfangled things, we've always done those things. Right. Every spring when the fishing gangs go out here, we have a pile of wood chips from cutting wood for the winter. When they're done cleaning them fish, we dig a hole right in the middle of that huge pile of wood chips, put in the fish, okay, creating our own fertilizers from resources that we have. So I think that's really, really important for us. No tilling for is kind of a newer thing that we think of, but we've planted hundreds of acres of corn as Indigenous peoples. All we use is a stick. So there's not a lot of mechanization needed there to do that. Even the talk today, I've been trying to read and try to keep up on some of the science and things in big agriculture, but they talk about microbials and all the things that are living. And it's just like, it seems like it's been the last few years they've been talking about that. But in the language of my people, my grandfather, he had words for them. He called those underground networks, he called them spider webs. That was the word in our language that we had for those microbial, all those things, those networks that we see underground. And he knew how, you put those mulches, you never turn that in, because as he would say, when we put new wood chips down, he says, it doesn't know it's dead yet. Right. So in his thinking, so that would allow the sapwood, the good nourishment from the sapwood to continue to drain into the soil before he would make a season go by before he would turn it into the soil. Because he said it doesn't know it's dead yet, it's still, and we know that's true. And we try to cut trees down and just try to sprout them. Lots of permanent beds. So today we are starting, one of the things that is a change for Indigenous people is being put on reservations and cattle into a little area, as modern agriculture is starting to see the ramifications of that as well. There was a time when everybody had pristine land just to go and use. Now they got to stay where they are. So we do have to start to look at how do we build that soil, like with more of our natural techniques. And the important thing is that we really have to concentrate where it is that we're working at. We don't need to spray the whole field when we're only using, a little bit of it. So those are a lot of the things. But those other resources that we have, the seaweeds and the algae and the grasses, all those things come back in. Nitrogen has never been a problem. Our intercropping has been an ancient form of our agriculture, using beans to intercrop, using all kinds of companion plants to control pests, all these kinds of use of using one thing to support another. Even since the larger majority culture started, they've gotten their head around this. They call 3 sisters. Well, in our languages, we actually have 5 sisters, right? But the whole point is that it's about the system of agriculture, right? It's not just corn, beans, and squash. You think of that as corn, beans, and squash as an agricultural system, meaning how do I use all the plants? So in my 3 sisters garden, which a European would call it a 3 sisters garden, there's actually anywhere up to 9, 10, or 11 plants that support that growing, right? Some providing pesticides, some providing other nutrients, some just being, nice taproot for a well down into the soil. So all those kinds of things are important to us. We also, we are very much into biodiversity, okay? And I think even though we have these huge monocrop, like fields with thousands and thousands of acres of one crop, we got to run lines down them and start that. You see the techniques of agroforestry where they're trying to intercrop with trees. They're just trying to do a lot of things. So I think, people got to start to like open their eyes to what else. And there is a lot of good research being done. It would be nice to see more agricultural research dedicated towards working with Indigenous people, because it's really important to us too, at the end of the day, is that we bring spirit back to agriculture, okay? For the Haudenosaunee people, agriculture is a female entity, because females are life givers, okay? So when we're sitting here on the panel, no offense to the men, but I only see one other lady, and yet in our communities, it's all women that do the farming, because our purpose is to feed our families good foods. That's what we go out for, right? So it's nice to see, but we got to keep our eye on the men. Because I tell my guys, they're gonna want to get on a tractor and do all those mechanical things, but we have to pull them back sometimes. So as a male and a female involved in agriculture, we have to learn to balance each other for the good of the system. We have to learn to honor and acknowledge earth, and through ceremony and taking time to realize, whatever kind of agriculture we have is the kind of earth that we're going to have. So that's a really powerful thing when you're just, a lonely little farmer working on your farm every day. So now go.
Thanks, Terry Lynn. That was moving. And the phrase you used, earth healers, is the sort of the kind of chief description of farming. I think is a really good frame for this whole discussion. We have also with us Darren Coleman. Many of you in the agriculture community, I'm sure will know Darren. He's national director of climate crisis and action at the National Farmers Union, and he's done a lot of work and authored studies on the issue of climate change and agriculture, which is really not agriculture per se; it's the inputs that go into agriculture. And Darren, you've commented in the past about the system that we've created, our modern agriculture system, where we have things like federal insurance that incentivizes farmers to do things that hurt their soil, might give them short-term productivity bumps, hurt their soil, increase their costs and their debt, and vastly increase greenhouse gas emissions, which are now quite at odds with the national climate prerogative, not to mention farmers' economic resilience and long-term health of the soil. You commented on the system that we've created and the disproportionate role that the big fertilizer companies have had in helping to influence, to shape this system in our sort of modern system of democracy. And I wondered if you might just say a few words about how do we get this system? You can describe the system a little bit, that we do have this modern agriculture system that we do have here in Canada writ large. And what do we do to fix it from a climate perspective?
Sure. Thanks very much, Toby. Ralph, thanks for your very incisive opening remarks. And Terry Lynn, thank you for everything you've reminded us of, and from the past, the present, and looking into the future. Really, really pleased to have this opportunity. I'll just mention a couple of things. There's been just a tremendous move forward over the last year or two in terms of understanding emissions and solutions, and even building that understanding within government agencies. Farmers for Climate Solutions has been key to that, and Gillian's going to talk, I think, more about that. We at the NFU have been really taking a hand in this. We did a report in 2019 called Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis. And over the last year or two, we're developing across Canada a really fine-grained, high-resolution look at where the emissions are coming from in agriculture and the food system. And we're doing that to underpin our work to reduce those emissions. And that work is both on-farm changes and government policies and programs that can support farmers in making those changes and accelerate that emission reduction, and at the same time support farmers' net farm income, their climate resilience, and just making healthy farm communities. So we've got an increasingly fine-grained look at these emissions and the solutions. But I just want to start, rather than sort of getting into the details, I just want to start with some real big picture foundational understanding of this. And it ties in with what Terry Lynn was saying. The key thing, I think, and Ralph touched on this, the key thing to understand about agricultural greenhouse gas emissions is the emissions coming out of the system are largely a function of the inputs going in. We're pushing in millions of tons of fossil fuels, of fertilizer made from fossil fuels, agrochemicals that take fossil fuel inputs, even plastics and steel, and the steel in our machinery. So increasingly, as the last century has unfolded, we found ways to push more and more petroleum-derived inputs into the system, and this has led to a situation where we've got more and more greenhouse gases, CO, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane coming out the other end. So the reason this is so important to understand is, if it's the inputs causing the emissions, then the thing we know is any low emission farm and food system will be a low input farm and food system. And again, getting back to this big picture, long-term view, what we like to remind people is we've had 10,000 years or more of agriculture. And for 99% of that time, it was low input, solar powered, and it was zero net emission. Farmers farmed for 9,900 years or more, and they did not affect the atmosphere or the climate. So we know that low emission food production is possible. What we've done over the last 100 years is we've done something unprecedented. We've created a very high input, high emission food system. And to tie back to your question, Toby, you know, what do we need to do and how are government policies driving it? In Canada, right from the highest levels, the core directive is to maximize exports. We've got an export maximization policy. This leads to a production maximization policy. And unfortunately, that leads to an input maximization policy. And the unintended consequence is we're also maximizing the emissions coming out the other end. So we need to, and this lines up with what Terry Lynn was saying, we need to rethink what a food system is for. We need to rethink our core goals around that food system. And we need to align federal and provincial policy in ways that move us to optimize those inputs, reduce those emissions, build resilience, and build sustainability rather than just trying to every year produce more billions of output. So just one last thing to pick up on something Ralph said, the inputs are really what's driving this. The increases, the doubling and redoubling of nitrogen fertilizer is driving the emissions. And when you take the upstream energy use to make those emissions like fertilizers and machinery, the numbers are even higher than the ones that Ralph showed. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to be on the panel today, and I look forward to the contributions of the other panelists.
Thanks, Darren. If I could just to follow up, you talked about the nitrogen emissions. It's the biggest part of the growth story in emissions in the agriculture sector in Canada from the inputs. And farmers are using these inputs, as you've sort of written about, for a couple of reasons, partially because it's encouraged through federal programs, sometimes required as a condition for insurance, for better management programs, but also presumably because it boosts, it boosts production on some time frame. So if we were to shift dramatically away from nitrogen, become more efficient using it just where it really helps, but dramatically reduce the amount of nitrogen we use, are we going to be compromising with the amount of yields that we get in a significant way? Or is there a way to do this where we can get a similar yield over time from our land?
An answer in 3 quick parts. One, through efficiency and optimization and just using more care around these inputs, we can reduce the input use quite dramatically without affecting yields. Second, I would say that we're making poor use of a lot of the higher yield products coming out of there. We've got a lot of food waste, etc., and food waste, denutritionalization of food, etc. And the third thing I would say is we need to find ways to maintain yield without all the industrial inputs. We often say that we need to find ways to get what we need on our farms from biology and ecology and less from industry. So we had 99% of the time we farmed, the things we needed on our farms came from our farms. There were closed nutrient loops, etc. We can't wholly get back to that. The world has changed, but we can utilize some of that knowledge and some of those techniques to reduce external inputs while maintaining the food supplies we need.
Interesting. So there's a few parts to that, the whole supply chain, food waste being a huge piece, but just on that farmer perspective from a sort of yield and margin, be interesting, Gillian, you operate a farm, the new farm, and also you're president of the Canadian Organic Growers Association. Does this work? Is this a nice idea, or does regenerative organic low carbon farming, does it actually work? I know it's a bit of a rhetorical question for you, but it'd be interesting if you could just share with us some of the evidence behind that.
Sure. Thanks, Toby. It's really great to be here. I also want to say it's a privilege to be part of this panel, and it's an exciting discussion. So the reason that I'm here is that it really works, and it's really exciting for farmers. So when we talk about climate change mitigation, and we start to think about the role that agriculture can play, it has a much bigger role to play in profitability for farmers and co-benefits around water, soil quality, and a whole other host of, clean air. It has a number of co-benefits. So let me talk about our farm. We have a 100-acre farm. We're about an hour and a half north of Toronto. We grow primarily salad mixes and cucumbers. And we only grow on about 25 or 30 acres of our farm that we grow vegetables on. And coming back to Terry Lynn's discussion, we are trying to create a closed loop circuit on our farm. So we use our whole farm, but about 70% of it is in eco services. We are currently in the process of certifying to regenerative organic. These standards, it's a new certification that's out of the States, if many people are starting to hear about, developed by Rodale, Patagonia, and others. I know DAG's going to talk about that because they're taking a lead on this as well at Nature's Path. But this is it's a baseline certification of organic. And the thing people need to understand currently is that certified organic is the only way right now to guarantee that some of these practices to a consumer are in place. The majority of these regenerative practices are already included in organic agriculture. However, as a certified organic farm, we found back in 2017, we were doing some things that were not regenerative on our farm. We were tilling regularly. We needed to increase our biodiversity. We hadn't integrated animals. And so as we transition through this program right now with the ROC, we custom graze cattle for another farm throughout our farm. We have 18 beehives. And most importantly, we've gotten rid of tillage. And what this has done is that it has really allowed us to increase our soil organic matter. So there's a direct ratio between carbon in the soil and soil organic matter. The majority of farms in Canada are somewhere between 1.5% and 3%. Darren, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Soil organic matter. And on our farm, we built ours to between 4 and 6.5%. And for every 1% increase we manage to obtain in our soil organic matter, we can absorb approximately 25,000 gallons of water per acre for a storm, for example. So what does that mean? That means that we are on our farm a full month earlier than our neighbors across the street who have really low organic matter in their soil and have a lot of tillage. So I'm glad you're pulling this picture up here as well. This is a picture, if everyone can see it, of our garden. So this is lettuce that was planted on the same day, same weather conditions. And on the left, we hadn't tilled the soil. And on the right, we had. And that is the only difference here. So we had, firstly, a decrease in weeds. We had a huge increase in germination without irrigation. We had increase in yield, which is really exciting. And this was just after one round of 2 weeks of not tilling in between plantings here. The other exciting thing is we've been through Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario, we've been in a number of trials around this practice of no tilling. We put tarps down in between on our scale. And we found that, interestingly, that soil temperature is significantly reduced in our soil that is not tilled. And what that means for a farm like ours, for example, is that when we have these stretches now of 30-degree weather, many farmers are not able to germinate arugula and spinach, which are two of our primary products. And we are able to germinate no problem. And so we've gotten into situations actually where we've sold out. We had to close our farm early one year because there's such a run on our product because other people aren't able to germinate it at that time. And I think that's a real opportunity in Canada, is to build resiliency into our farms so that we can continue to grow food and have it locally. So I might leave it there for now. Happy to answer any questions.
Sure, Gillian, just before we go to Gary, because it'd be interesting to get some perspective from some bigger sort of this industrial agriculture system. Gary works with sort of all parts of the food chain there and has insights that will be useful. But it'd be interesting just first to get your perspective. There's an argument out there that we need these input intensive methods to feed the 8 billion people that we have. Unless we could figure out the food waste system, but taking that as a given, that the current food waste that we have, to produce the amount of food that we need to feed 8 billion people, people would starve if we didn't have the nitrogen inputs and this industrial intensive process. How do you have a counter for that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a scare tactic, quite frankly, that's been put out there, I think, by conventional agriculture, really chemical-based agriculture, who have profitability in continuing to grow in the current fashion that we are. So the first thing I want to say is that there are more calories currently per person available at the store level than there are people on the planet. So the first thing is we have enough food. We're growing the wrong kind of food. We're putting a lot of these calories into high fructose corn syrup and processed foods and all those types of things. The second thing is that over 30 million acres per year are desertified through agriculture. And that means taking arable farmland and turning it into unusable desert through non-regenerative agricultural practices, high intensity chemical farming, tillage, those sorts of things. And through these regenerative practices, which is really exciting, they're starting to bring this farmland back into production. And so, and at the same time, sequestering carbon, cleaning air, cleaning water. So I think we're really focusing on the wrong syllable here when we are talking about not being able to grow enough food and needing more of the same, because it's currently not working.
That's helpful. Gary Soft is the senior digital agribusiness consultant at IBM, studied agriculture at Guelph and has worked with large companies on the spectrum, and now he's really focused on the technology piece for solving this. But you're in touch, Gary, with a lot of these bigger players and have absorbed some of their perspective. What are some of the biggest barriers that you see to making this shift, this transition from sort of the input intensive farming to more of a regenerative, organic, lower carbon method?
Certainly. Thanks, Toby. Happy to be here. Everyone, hello, everyone. It's not so much a roadblock as it's what I would consider maybe a speed bump, in that the time to adoption to get to a truly regenerative, carbon positive ecosystem or farm system is going to take time. It's taken time to get to the point where we're at. We are, and I say we, as a globe, we are feeding a lot more people than we have 100 years ago. There are totally different practices in place, and to kind of shift an entire system, there's going to be other impacts that happen, because agriculture is an input system, as was mentioned, and as you bring new inputs in, or you change those inputs, you're likely going to change the system and other downstream impacts for that. So from a kind of, it's a really broad question, Toby, that I'll try to answer with technology kind of looped in and around that. First and foremost, there's kind of throughout the US and in Canada, broadly kind of everywhere, there's a big push to push cover crops and no-till. So in the US, there are carbon programs that are, these large agribusinesses, whoever, are coming forth with growers, offering an incentive if growers change their practices to either cover crops or no-tillage. When we look at Canada with that same lens and that similar kind of package, it becomes really difficult, because as you look to Western Canada, it's not necessarily that growers don't want to plant a cover crop. It's that the seasons may not allow them, or the moisture in the season may not allow them. And then there's other very operational aspects that growers are thinking about, and that they have a planter that they've used with tillage, or maybe it's the crop rotation that they need to think about what diseases could be hosts in that cover crop species. How do I terminate that cover crop to go to my planting methods? Now, sure, there are absolutely ways to overcome these. And that's why I say it's a bit of a speed bump, because there are real mechanical on-farm agricultural things, agronomy things that can change, while at the same time, data is now starting to come and help this whole push. And so from the technology and data side, how it's really helping, I'll say, with this movement, and there's a lot of different pressures that are, existing in the sustainable green agriculture movement, if you will. And it's, really relates to data and technology. So data comes first, and tech can also enable some of that data collection, but it really starts with data. And that it is kind of the new commodity on a lot of farms, but I want to put an asterisk next to the word commodity, because quality is very important. and it's not to be decommoditized, and that the value of the data is going to be in the quality. You need to understand what's there, and so that you can have accurate records as you're doing a lot of your reporting or downstream analytics on that data. Next would be the collection and the user interfaces for growers, for farmers, for industry. We're seeing a lot more movement in the area of, let's help growers collect data. What hybrid did you plant on your field? How much irrigation did you apply? What kind of tractor do you have? All these very, to a farmer is going to be top of mind. Let's have that in a digital record so that future generations can have an understanding of really what's going on. Next would be really getting into the definitions of data. So working on so that, as an industry, we can understand what it is that we're driving towards. Let's work with consumers. Let's work with everyone to get a common definition of what sustainability, what regenerative carbon positive farming means. Whatever those aspects are going to be, if data can be the underlying factor and everyone can understand a graph or a visual, let's get to the same common understanding so that we can drive towards those same goals. Weather, and next would be kind of weather and environmental insights are really helping to drive this. So, every farmer has, 3 or 4 apps on their phone that tell them the weather. I'm actually shocked that no one's brought up the weather here yet. But now it's really getting to a level of subfield accuracy where now growers can understand which of my fields within my farming operation have gotten water, have an environmental insight to them. So, are the conditions appropriate for the rising of an insect or the, showing up of a pathogen, which can lead into a disease? Are there things that I can do from a management side, leveraging those environmental insights that are going to produce or protect more of my yield at the end of that season, which is then going to lead to, more yield, more of an abundance for that grower and the overall broader market. It's also leading to, entirely new conversations for growers and retail. So there is a fundamental shift that's happening where historically, it could have been that the conversation of sales for the following year has started with the seed. It all starts with the seed. Well, now where does that seed go? It goes into the soil. So we're starting to see growers and overall just generally have more conversations of, let's start our agronomic plans for this coming year at the soil level. Let's start to understand our soil, how we can have a healthy soil that's going to promote a healthy crop so that we can keep it in that system, manage our carbon to nitrogen ratios, et cetera, and think about our agriculture crop as a system instead of just a single crop being put by single fertilizers. How can we, as was mentioned before, use the natural forces of nature to try and help drive our system to be kind of more productive? On the technology side, there are things that are really coming together. So, there are for our nutrient stewardship within Canada, which is the right rate, the right source, the right timing, and the right placement of fertilizers. That's a huge push to really start to leverage a lot of these new technologies which can come into place, which have been driven by things like auto steer, leading to variable rate applications of various products that go in fields. So, the comment was made before, perhaps we don't need to spray the whole field. Let's just spray either where the disease is, where the crop is, or where the problem is, or even put fertilizer at different rates throughout that field, depending on what our goal is, what our actions are going to be. It's also allowing, a shift to an outcome market. So that sounds like a simple thing to say, but agriculture's been, a lot of inputs. You buy your inputs, and then once a year, the farmer will sell their outputs or their harvest, their yield. They'll sell their bushels. Now it's, as these programs come together, we want to see a carbon reduction, which is really an outcome of what a grower or a farmer is going to do. So if it's plant a cover crop, if it's reduce their tillage, a change in a practice, that's going to change and come to an outcome of something that's going to happen downstream. And so it's the start of leveraging data to really go at problems in a whole new way, potentially creating entirely new business models. Other than that, on the technology side, there's a lot of infrastructure and marketplaces that are really starting to pop up to allow, trading of this information and trading of these carbon credits, whatever they may be, whatever those are, a lot into ecosystems. So that's a lot of, the marketplace mentality. It's a lot about partnering. So, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. It does cost a lot of money to build a lot of the digital infrastructure that's needed for a lot of this data transfer to really happen, because as we know, data in agriculture is often in silos. Much of agriculture exists in different compartmentalized units where you might know your fertilizer, you might know your seed, et cetera. When that data can really come together and it's interoperable, its operability is there, and that you can start to, look at my financial transactions relative to my agronomic plans, and then how can I adjust those and what are the insights between them? AI and crop modeling is also another adjustment to, really helping growers, helping the industry understand how crops are progressing through the season, through a modeled approach to really give insights, whether that's through crop scouting, whether that's through crop progression, really helping everyone understand, hey, where's my farm? How is it contributing? And what do I need to look for? What are my watch outs? How can data help us be more ecological. Let's work ahead, be proactive instead of always reactive to problems. The last kind of push that's, really starting to see from a technology side is, there's things that are coming from technology now for growers that it is at a turning point where growers are going to be able to collect enough data. There's going to be enough accurate data that, new business models, new ways of doing business are going to pop up. So what we are seeing are, like fintech, insurtechs starting to make their entrances with the green underneath of those, meaning, are there other rates available for growers that, qualify because they meet a certain set of criteria, which can be underlined with data? That's going to transition some of the risk of this. I just saw record high prices for urea. No farmer wants to, lose any of their valuable inputs that they put into their production system. How can we work together with lending, insurance, these kind of things? If all this data is present, how can we limit the risk and kind of offset some of those things? Last point on technology, which kind of leads into the regenerative portion of this, is the recent 6.8 metric tons of crush capacity in the Western Canada. That can ultimately produce a lot of, renewable diesel, which, if you think of renewable diesel entering a production system of agriculture, where you have a renewable diesel entering a tractor and a sprayer and a combine, which is all then going into producing renewable feedstock, which would feed those kind of places, that creates a really interesting picture on what does a carbon negative farm look like, or, what does a closed loop ecosystem look like for various products, whichever those may be. So I'll kind of leave it there, Toby. That's a generalization of, there's a lot going on. Data is a really exciting time. It's going to give a voice to a lot of farmers, which, that really hits with me growing up on a farm there, is that, this is going to allow farmers to have totally new conversations with the industry, the consumers, and it's going to help close that gap, not only of say and do, but the farmer and the consumer, which is, the rural and urban have conversations on a common meaning, common understanding.
Interesting. Just a quick couple follow-ups on the 6.8 metric tons. If I caught that right, could you just say, I didn't catch exactly the crush. What is that exactly that you were talking about?
It's there have been a number of commodity crush plants released in Western Canada. So as a part of the clean fuel standard, there's been a number of things that have been imposed on the industry. And as part of that, there's an additional 6.8 metric ton capacity of, I'm not sure if it's all canola crush, but there's a 6.8 increase in metric ton of crush capacity, which will then produce biofuels, which can then go to the biofuel market or into the renewable diesels market as well.
That's okay. And it's interesting, all that data you were talking about, and commenting on the, how the weather hadn't come up, the most common conversation point for Canadians, and I guess people around the world, especially here with weather being such an important part of our life and changing so much. So it's not the farmer's almanac, it's way beyond that in terms of what you're talking about. But when we're thinking about common metrics and definitions, we're so important, if there's going to be a market, that there be trust, that sort of trust between people, consumer, buyer, producer. And I wonder, and trust is easier to do where there's less ambiguity. So I wonder what that sort of common metric might be, if it, in terms of what technology can measure in real time, and markets could be linked to, whether it was federal supports or other types of offset markets, but at scale, probably more federal supports. There's some consumer demand for this, but the federal supports could do a lot at scale. Is it what Gillian was talking about, the organic, the percent of the soil that's organic, that sort of, you hit a threshold, and then is that the metric? Or the carbon metric is something that has to be monitored year over year, or it's so that that's another metric that's more singular. And then of course there's all these standards, maybe more the regenerative organic standard, the ROC standard that we're gonna hear a little bit about from Deg. But what do you see as sort of what makes sense if we're trying to focus in on where technology could do real-time monitoring, verification, reporting to transfer that information from farm to world?
That's a great question. How I would start that is that trust is earned by an ounce and it's lost by a wheelbarrow full. So it's something that takes time, and if you lose that trust, it's gone. And in agriculture, that's not going to be any different. So when we're thinking about what metric to use, soil organic matter is certainly one that can be measured. There are satellites that can derive and predict where soil organic carbon is going to be in a field. So there's certainly models that can help us to get to that point. It seems like a good place to start, but then you can really start to think, okay, am I farming for soil organic matter? Am I farming for my nitrous oxide emissions? How do I control those in a balance? So it's it's not an easy answer to just say, I think that soil organic matter should be the answer. To me, it's like, let's work together with whoever's, the government and the industry, and let's meet people where they are, because this isn't going to be a turn a light switch on and we're all of a sudden going to lose a bunch of emissions. This is going to be, let's work together and progress down a path that we can sustain this movement. And it's not just, there's various places and examples where if you cut it hard, it doesn't work. Let's work together and find that commonality and really move forward, because there are ultimately practices that come from the organic and conventional side that both sides can, let's come together as an entire industry that grow food and the food system and come up with what these metrics should be. That's going to enable that trust and earn the trust of the consumer and kind of keep that at the farm level.
Interesting. Well, it's nice to see the momentum, especially on the sort of the consumer and on the major sort of food manufacturer side to get. And so there'll be some angel in the details in terms of what the definitions are, and that'll be something that we all get to influence. Dag Falk's with us, has been with Nature's Path for 18 years, and many of you will know Nature's Path probably are nourished by their tasty cereals. I'm not under contract with Nature's Path, but my kids eat it almost every morning, and they're growing up nicely so far. So and it's quite tasty. It's one of the few things they eat consistently. So thanks for that. But Dag, you've spent a lot of time looking at soil sequestration and how to use how to get that supply for the Nature's Path to be at that kind of gold standard. And it'd be interesting to sort of just, you've talked about there's different philosophies for how we move forward, and we need more than one philosophy. But if you could just sort of kind of lay out for us what a regenerative carbon, low carbon farm system looks like, and what we can do to accelerate that.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm also pleased to be here and really encouraged by the spirit of coming together. That we have to solve this together. So I think, when we think about the tools, and the conversations around capturing more carbon in the soil, and regenerative is kind of a movement that's sprung up around that agenda is increasing the sequestration of carbon in the soil. And the tools that we hear talked about that we're going to be using to get there are things like cover crops, crop rotations, less tillage, and those kind of practices. And so I think we need to also think about what is it that those practices accomplish, because it's not the practice that we're after, it's what it does for us that we're after, right? And what those practices basically do is they either provide protection for the life in the soil. And when I say the life in the soil, I'm talking about the microbial communities, microorganisms that live in the soil. That's a food web, interconnected ecosystem that functions as a whole. That no part of the soil functions in isolation. No single organism is responsible for everything. And most organisms can't function without the other organisms there. So it's this incredibly complex life web under the soil, and so either it feeds that soil life, or it protects it so it doesn't get damaged. Because, and why do we want to do that? We want to do that because that soil life is in fact the only thing that's responsible for, and the only thing that can capture and sequester carbon into the soil. There's nothing else. We can't take a bag of something and put it on. We can't put more carbon in the soil. We have to have those organisms in the soil do it for us. And it's their life. So, as those microbial life forms turn over, like the life, they live and die, that process is what actually captures the carbon and holds it for the period of time when the life is happening. And so when we talk about locking carbon in the soil, it's not this little bit of a misnomer, because we're not really locking it in forever. We're locking it in whilst there is still healthy soil. That meaning healthy organisms in the soil that are having their life happen, meaning the carbon is needed for that. And so it's a dynamic system that we have to strive for in agriculture. And that dynamic system has to be include healthy soil at the highest levels, because that's what's going to draw the carbon down. So, that's the context for which we have come up with these practices, and we haven't come up with all the practices. This is just a short list of practices, I think, that we'll use to enhance this life in the soil. And that's what's exciting about our times, is that we actually have technology, and we have experience, and we have different viewpoints that can bring different parts of insights into this conversation. At Nature's Path, we've focused on organic as the pathway for us to kind of get to the world that we want to live in, and it's a strong decision, because we in organic farming, we eliminate a bunch of the tools that would make farming easier. Achieving high yields is easier if you use nitrogen fertilizer, synthetically produced using fossil fuels. And there's a great temptation to do that. And that's why the world is doing what it's doing. For the last 100 years, when those kind of fertilizers became available, we started using them, as humanity, we started using them more and more and more and more. And I think now we're sort of at a peak of we're really excited. We can get more yields because we can use more. What organic has done is we are sort of the experiment, like when, 100 years ago, when that fossil fuels came, synthetic fertility came along as an option, we said, we're not going to do that. We're going to see if we can carry on like the way we used to. We're going to, just use the resource of the life in the soil as the fertility base. If we take care of the life in the soil, that's going to provide the fertility for the plants. We don't need to add anything. And so we were going to be the let's see how it goes kind of thing. Can it be done? And that's what we're doing still today. We're farming, having taken away from ourselves the opportunity to use these more artificial inputs that could really make it easier for us, but we're not going to do it. Because philosophically, we believe there's value in that way of farming, where we focus solely on the health of the soil. Nature's Path has a farm, 5,000-acre farm in Saskatchewan that we got into 2017, and we got that farm to learn more about farming and to also be part of the leading edge of learning about how to incorporate even more more regenerative practices in organic, because organic is really in some ways the original regenerative farming system. And so, but we think it still has some improvements that could be happening. And so this ROC program, ROC, Regenerative Organic Certification, has been developed, and it's kind of the tool that we can use to really engage in this and get farmers to have a way of doing this, because otherwise farmers will just have to do it on their own, and people may or may not know what they're doing, and they may or may not get rewards for it. But with a program, just like the organic program provides a premium to organic farmers, the ROC program, if you get certified, it'll provide a premium, and people will know what you can tell people what you're doing. You can tell your customers what kind of system you're farming under. And so we were part of the pilot for the ROC program on our farm. And so we trialed out, what the system was like and how we could improve our practices. We've had successes and we've had failures in that process. And we're now engaged with the Canadian organic growers in developing a program for farmers to go through that transition from organic to regenerative organic, like adding those practices. How can we do that and maintain yield at high levels and make it as positive an experience as possible for the farmers? Because it's important that we don't add more challenges to farmers. It's hard enough as it is. Just kind of wanted to say one thing about the concept that we have is yield. We all want high yields. We don't want to produce food. Of course, that's what farming is all about. But we have this concept of yield per acre. And I think that there's some fallacy in that really, when we're talking about agriculture, including organic agriculture and conventional agriculture, it's really, you can achieve very high yields with adding nitrogen. That and it's kind of artificial in a way. And so I think what's more interesting than yields per acre is yield per input, or yield per barrel of oil. How many barrels of oil does it take to maintain a yield? And because that's what it costs to get these high yields. And if we take away that input, we will in most cases for sure start out with lower yields. It takes time to build that soil health up to match the yields, which incidentally is possible, but it can take time, and it will definitely be more challenging. But if you take that artificial input out of it, then the yields that you're left with is really what the soil, agricultural soil, is capable of providing. And that's the true yield per acre. It's really, the rest of it is yield per input. And so those inputs aren't free. As we know, the price is going up like crazy right now. And they also aren't free in terms of side effects. They have a detrimental side effects. One thing, they kill microorganisms in the soil. If you add nitrogen to soil, the microorganisms are set back. A number of them will die, and it will not help them flourish. It sets them back. And that's the microorganisms we need to capture carbon in the soil. So we don't want to set them back. And so that's kind of what we're thinking is, we got to change the world of agriculture to become more like organic. We're not saying the whole, everything has to be organic or certified, but we think that we have a model that's worth having a close look at, and that can offer tools to conventional agriculture to adopt. And the learnings that we've had, I think, fit right into the conversations that we have today that we need to really all get our heads wrapped around. And also, organic is the best system of agriculture that we're aware of that has, we have very, very clear definitions. We have standards that are, 80 pages long or more. So very, very tightly described the system of organic, what you can do, what you can't do. And we have annual oversight from organic inspectors that come out each year to the farm to verify. The application process is vigorous, which farmers complain about because it's a lot of paperwork and record, having records and all that sort of stuff. But that oversight, that third-party oversight, provides a great value for customers that they can really see. This is something I can trust. And so we're not just a bunch of people doing this weird farming on the side. This is a real serious system. We have real track history, and we have been a niche and small, and we haven't really talked to conventional agriculture traditionally or for a long time. But now that's changing because we realize we're part of it. We're part of everything, and we want to be part of it. It's time for us to step up and come out and share with the bigger world of agriculture. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Toby.
Thanks, Dick. I had just a few quick follow-up questions, and it's interesting what Nature's Path is doing now. Certainly is a niche. If I have the figures correct, I think your annual sales are kind of approaching $500 million a year. So this is happening, starting at a much larger scale. I was really intrigued, and thanks for kind of taking us through at the beginning about the kind of live ecosystem that exists under our soil. It's a living system. We sometimes look at it more as a sort of input-output kind of model, and it's a living system. And I was wondering, we had a question in the questions about what if we were making nitrogen from ammonia that came from green hydrogen, so not from fossil fuels, and using that as an input. Is that something that kind of fits in with the regenerative farming, or is it inconsistent with that sort of that living ecosystem that you described underneath in the soil?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and I'm not an expert on hydrogen as a source for the energy, but assuming that it could be done kind of without causing damage to produce it, without pulling fossil or releasing fossil fuels, I guess, into the their carbon into the atmosphere. So it would release less carbon, but the the effect on the soil will probably be equal. Like if it's nitrogen, it's nitrogen, right? If it's so that the effect on the soil is going to be the same negative as it is as it is now. And I can give you an example of that with there's something called Chilean nitrate or sodium nitrate, which is mined in Chile. That's why it's called Chilean. It's a mined source of almost pure nitrogen, and it is not allowed in organic in Canada, and the reason for that, it is natural, comes from the ground, it's just mined, and the reason why it's not allowed is because it's a quick acting fertilizer, quick acting nitrogen, and that quick action is quick release. Like once you put it in there, it's immediately available for the plant's roots to take up that nitrogen. And the microorganisms in the pathway of that nitrogen being in the soil, being ready for the roots to take up, the microorganisms in that pathway get destroyed basically. And that will happen because it's quick acting, and that will happen for any method of production, I think, for nitrogen.
Okay, interesting. And I'm sure I saw Darren's eyebrows rising on the nitrogen question. But I also just want to quickly we have some discussion going on in the chat around biochar. And this is something that I've seen come up over the last 15 years or even more, is a potential significant solution for storing carbon and having regenerative agriculture. Do you see, is this a scale solution, or is there an issue with it? Biochar.
To me, biochar is still a fairly young technology. And so we don't, we've had some people sing its praises and say, we're going to save the earth with this. And others are saying, nah, it doesn't really work that well. So I think the jury is still out, and we haven't got a consistent understanding of how it can be used. One of the things I believe is that if the people that have said it doesn't really work have used biochar that is not inoculated with microorganisms. And if you have to be extreme, say dead soil with low levels of microorganisms in it, and you put biochar in it, biochar is housing for microorganisms. That's where they go and live, and it's very safe housing. It's like an amazing apartment complex. And if the life in the soil isn't already there, there's nobody to move in, and the benefit doesn't happen. But if you inoculate it, so it's common now to inoculate biochar with compost, with supercharged microorganisms in compost. Put that together with the biochar, create that living space already occupied. Putting that in the soil, now you're inoculating the soil with even more microorganisms, or the ones already there can also move in. Then I think that has a much better success rate. And so and how is a biochar created? I understand there's many different technologies, the temperature differences, all kinds of technical parameters, and I don't know that we've fine-tuned it totally yet, but yeah, very hopeful, very hopeful. It's resource intensive again though, because the process does take energy, and it also takes an input source. So it's basically carbon. Where does that carbon come from? So we have to think that through. If it can come from waste product like rice hulls or oat hulls or something like that, so it comes from agriculture, then awesome. We should try to explore this as far as we can.
Okay, thanks. So it sounds like some angel in detail, like for most things. There's some good resources I see getting posted, or some of the resources I recognize, but and a number of resources being posted in the chat. So we also have with us Adam Noble, and Adam is bringing down the average age of the panel. He was one of the Corporate Knights top 30 under 30 sustainability leaders in Canada. And Adam heads up a company called Noble Gen out of Peterborough, which has raised tens of millions of dollars and is doing all sorts of really cutting edge, pioneering research and practice to kind of close the gap in this really wasteful food system we've created. We talked about the food we waste at the sort of, after it hits our fork, stuff that gets thrown out or thrown out at the grocery store. But when you look at our fossil fuel energy system, or our energy system underpinned by fossil fuels, you see how inefficient, how much waste, how much energy is lost along the way. And when you look at our food system, in particular, the way that we create meat, it's just off the charts how much waste there is. It's 90% waste all over the place, and that's before accounting for the sort of fossil fuel component. And so, Dave, Adam, you're looking at technologies to crack this nut, so we can feed the 8 billion people, nourish them with affordable, good quality food. And you're thinking about this in a sort of 360 degree. Everything from how the pulse is farmed and sourced to how does it all come together and get delivered. It'd be really interesting to just sort of share with us your vision for the food system that your fast-growing company is working to create, and then any insights you have on what we can all do as a community to speed that up.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Toby, and it's really exciting to be here today, and thank you so much for inviting me. Definitely feel coming at this from a very different angle from the rest of the panelists, and I think companies like Noble Gen have so much to learn from the people on the front lines of the agricultural changes that are needing to happen right now, as well as the traditional knowledge that we are so thankful and lucky to be able to build from and remember the solutions that are already existing here, which is so exciting. And for Noble Gen, yeah, we definitely have a very unique approach to the challenge today, and we really view the world as limitless opportunity for living solutions to these very big challenges in front of us. And we focus on tapping into the limitless potential of microorganisms and empowering them to co-create products and solutions to make a more sustainable world, which is really exciting to hear how many times microbes have come up today. And I think for us, we've been able to interface our microbes into the food system in a very different way than the microbes today are working in the food chain, primarily in the soil and helping with the carbon cycling at the root, literally, and being able to help in that way. But I think one thing said earlier by Terry Lynn, I thought really was amazing about how the agricultural system that we have is going to create the world that we live in. And for us, when we're stepping back and looking at the agricultural system as a whole, if it's really the food chain that's feeding all of us, it's also the core living carbon cycle. And if we're not creating a food system that's able to utilize its inputs efficiently and use regenerative inputs, as well as utilize the outputs in a proper way, then we're going to create a very significant misbalance here with an opportunity to be really the largest carbon sink of the world, which I think gives us so much hope and excitement about what can be done. But we really need to have a paradigm shift in our thinking here to accomplish that. For us, we really focus on how we're using the outputs of what we already have today, because we're already using enough land, we're already producing enough calories to be able to feed everyone, as Gillian said earlier. But we're not producing them in the right locations, creating a lot of nutritional insecurities in some regions of the world, as well as not producing the right nutrients to feed us, which primarily is deficient in proteins. And today, with the world primarily relying upon animal sources as our protein source, having an added step to our agricultural system that it's like feeding more than one kind of animal in this process, humans or animals kind of being equivalent here. We can't afford to do that at the scale at what we're going at. And I think we know that animals are so critical in our agricultural system. And I think technology companies coming at this challenge by trying to demonize the animals is just so wrong, because we know that we wouldn't have a functioning carbon cycle without them. but being able to really see these microbes as a next generation livestock for the future that can take feedstocks and outputs from agriculture that have lower value or are not able to be used by us today, and then are able to upcycle them into additive nutrition and products that can feed people in a decentralized way, is really how we see building the sustainable agriculture system into the future. So really excited to be part of the solution to discussion, and feel that I think technology companies like mine have so much to learn, and excited to be here today.
Thanks, Adam. We have just about 9 minutes left, and you all are have thought a lot about this and are in the trenches doing work to create this more sustainable food system. And it'll be really interesting to get your perspective, just in a minute or so, on this question. What do you see as a key action that could move the needle significantly on regenerative low carbon farming over the next year? Is something that we could focus on, and maybe we're thinking, just, it's a big audience out here, but thinking about the federal government, which has some of the biggest levers to pull on this. Let's go in reverse order, and we'll go to you first, Adam.
Awesome, thanks, Tony. Well, I think the most important thing that we really need to be investing in is, and I think it was highlighted here today, is understanding our soils and how we can team up with the microbes that are already there to be able to sequester as much carbon and build as much biological carbon into the soil as possible, and kind of being aware of that from an agricultural standpoint, and being able to think about how we can either add more microbes or new communities in, or even just protect the ones that are there with kind of avoiding the inorganic nitrogen sources, or adding in things like the biochar to be able to help them grow better. And the biggest opportunity we have in Canada is the amount of land available, and how well our farmers are at growing. And if we're able to be more aware of what those microbes can do for sequestering carbon, we can be a huge part of the solution, and draw down so much carbon into the soil we already have.
Thanks. Jake?
Yes, as I said, our strategy is going organic. Everything we make is certified organic, and we follow that system, and we have our farmers follow that system, and that's kind of our way of ensuring that everybody's on the same page. And so by expanding organic, we feel like every day we sell more cereal, we transition more land into organic management systems, which means it's taking away from other management systems that may not be as good, in our opinion, for things like sequestering carbon. So that's our strategy, and we're fully committed to that. And at the same time, we recognize the strategy, other strategies such as reducing inputs in general agriculture, in conventional agriculture, improving methods, adding tools, adding practices like cover crops and crop rotations and so on. We support that, and we think this may seem kind of self-serving or something, because we're so into we're so in love with organic, is that as those practices start to get incorporated, and better tools are used for using the soil and the life in the soil for creating fertility, for instance, that the farmers doing that, they will find themselves getting closer and closer to organic. And one day they'll say, why don't I just get organic, get certified, and I'll get the premium, and it'll all be good. And so in a way, we're hoping that the whole world's going to go organic. We're not holding out for that in the short term, but that movement in that direction is what we think is going to get us there. But we're very happy, even if others are working on improving agriculture in ways that is never going to lead them to organic. We're still supportive of that. That's a great thing. We just aren't directly involved with that step ourselves. We're just an example.
Thanks, Doug. Gary?
Certainly. So mine kind of is, it's a two-part answer, and they definitely relate to each other. First would be, I guess, having a clear definition of what carbon or regenerative carbon plus farming means. And by that, from the federal level, can mean what data needs to go into it, what granularity, how often do we need it, and basically all the metrics and things that could go around what data could be produced to verify that someone is a regenerative carbon plus farmer. And then once we have that definition, it's going to be really important for everyone to come to the table, and let's work out our journey and our path forward together, instead of call it a mandate. Let's kind of work together on how we can move that needle collaboratively.
Thanks, Gary. Gillian?
So the Canadian Organic Growers and the NFU and 21 other farming organizations across Canada have come together to form a coalition called Farmers for Climate Solutions that's currently advocating for climate-friendly agricultural policy, because our current policy is not supporting these practices in the right type of agriculture. So in Canada currently, our government invests 73 times less than the EU and 13 times less than the United States on climate-friendly agricultural practices. And these are going to be our competitors going forward. So Farmers for Climate Solutions, which represents, again, over 20,000 farmers, is also currently training 10,000 farmers across 2 million acres on how to implement these practices. And so for me, I think we aren't going to get anywhere without changing policy, and we also need to educate farmers quickly and pay them for ecological services.
Thanks, Gillian. Darren?
Thanks, Toby. Thanks, everyone. In December 2020, when the federal government came out with its strengthened climate plan, what a lot of people didn't notice is that climate plan very courageously included a commitment to reduce emissions from fertilizer by 30%. And that fertilizer-related emission reduction is going to be key to bending that trend line downward that Ralph showed at the beginning. But it's also key for opening the door to a whole range of more diverse production practices like regenerative agriculture, agroecology, organic production that Dag talked about. So yeah, the signal from the biosphere, from the government, from consumers clearly is we need to get less from industry and more from biology. And I think that's the future.
Thanks, Darren. Terry Lynn, the last word on this is yours.
I think at the end of the day that we just got to go back to what our grandmas, our grandpas, and our dudas always taught us: do more with less. Okay, do more with less. The smartest people in the world, as far as I'm concerned, are the poorest. They know how to do shit and get shit done with nothing. So that's all I can say is let's use our brains that the Creator gave us, and let's get thinking together. Nyang'goa.
That's that is quite eloquent. And I think seems like one of the resounding themes of this is we use our brains that our Creator gave us and focus on the soil. There's salvation in the soil. That's the source of it all. I just want to take this opportunity to thank all the panelists for everything you're doing, all the wisdom that you shared with us today, all the attendees, this really a vibrant conversation we've been having, and all the folks who have joined us over this whole 5-part series. I think we've created a really rich tapestry of solutions and action points and a basis and a foundation for us to move forward. This is not something that's going to happen overnight, but it's something that needs to happen urgently. Each day, each week, we have 414 weeks until 2030, which is when a lot of these goals are. So that's not a lot of weeks. Every week counts, and really appreciate this community that is doing so much. And we're really looking forward to providing forums and spaces and telling the stories. And anybody who has stories to tell about how we move forward, we're all ears. We want to give light to those stories and help to speed up this journey to a better place and a more hopeful place that's within reach. So really appreciate everyone joining. Appreciate IBM enabling this and partnering with us, and looking forward to taking it to the next level. During Earth Day week, we'll be doing something similar to this, but with the entire G7 countries and a broader group of countries as well that are represent about 80% of global emissions, and focusing in on these major sectors to show the say-do gap and the opportunities to close them. And we'll be doing that on an annual basis. So thank you all of you for helping to build this model here in Canada that we'll be taking on the road globally, and also here paying close attention here at home in Canada. So have a great week, and stay warm and stay safe. So thanks for joining.